In the autumn of 2020, Armenia and Azerbaijan fought a 44-day-long war over the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh and its surrounding provinces, leading to thousands of civilian and military casualties, as well as more than 100,000 refugees. Despite a peace agreement, historical grievances, wartime atrocities, and nationalistic rhetoric have spurred continued violence and ethnic hatred between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Welcome to Dissidents and Dictators, a series of conversations by the Human Rights Foundation dedicated to exposing and challenging authoritarianism around the world.
My name is Alexander Sikorsky, and I'm a Program and Policy Fellow with the Human Rights Foundation. My guest today is Neil Hauer, a journalist and security analyst based in Yerevan, Armenia. He covered the 2020 war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and was one of the few international journalists that covered the entire conflict on the ground in Nagorno-Karabakh. Neil's work focuses on politics and conflict in the South Caucasus, Russia's role in the Syrian conflict, and violence and politics in the North Caucasus, particularly in Chechnya and Ingushetia. His writing has appeared in international publications including CNN, The Guardian, and Foreign Policy. He was previously an intelligence analyst for the SecDev group. Thank you so much for joining us, Neil. It's a pleasure to have you with us here today.
Hey, Alex, thanks so much for having me.
So to start off with, can you briefly explain the roots of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan?
Okay, that's always a fun question, briefly explaining this conflict. Let's say that the short version is, this disputed territory that of Nagorno-Karabakh, majority ethnic Armenian territory that is surrounded largely by ethnic Azeri territories. It was the subject of a conflict around the end of World War I, around 1918 to 1920, and then frozen during the Soviet period, during which time the ethnically Armenian Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast was placed within Soviet Azerbaijan. And towards the end of the Soviet Union, as the USSR began to collapse and nationalist movements emerged, the Armenian population of the Karabakh demanded union with the Armenian Soviet Republic. And this spurred bloody reprisals against Armenians in the Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic. And as the USSR collapsed, it escalated into a full-scale war that lasted from 1991 until 1994. And when the war ended, Armenian forces had secured not only the Karabakh Oblast itself, but then the 7 surrounding Azeri-populated districts of Azerbaijan proper. And that was the situation from 1994 until September 27th of last year, when Azerbaijan relaunched a military offensive after many years of rearming with their newfound oil wealth. And over the course of 44 days last year, Azerbaijan conquered or was regained control of, following the peace agreement, about 75% of the territory that our ethnic Armenians had controlled up until then.
Okay, and so why did Armenia and Azerbaijan fight a war this last autumn? What was the reason why it took so long for the Azerbaijanis to rearm? And was there any other reason behind that? Was there a spark that led to conflict in autumn 2020? Why didn't it happen earlier?
I mean, Azerbaijan spent many years rearming itself, especially through the mid-2010s was the peak of their military spending. Until they spent about $15 billion over the course of about 10, 12 years on new weaponry. And there were, there's always fighting along the line of contact. And then in 2016, there was the so-called 4-day war in April that resulted in Azerbaijan making minor territorial gains. But then, Azerbaijan continued to gather its strength. And then last year, in July, there was fighting on the northern border of Armenia proper in Azerbaijan. And then following that, Turkey started to support Azerbaijan more intensively, especially with their TB2 Bayraktar drones, which changed unmanned drones, which changed with precision guided munitions, which changed the balance of power dramatically. And, they began preparing for the war around then. And then, in late September, with much of the world distracted by A, COVID, and B, the U.S. election, A lot of factors just came together to make that an opportune moment to relaunch this war that that Baku had wanted, or the Ilham Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, had wanted for some time, and enough factors converged to make that the appropriate timing for them.
And so throughout the war, there were numerous reports of humanitarian law violations, including videos portraying the beheading of captives and other abuses against prisoners of war. How widespread do you think that these human rights atrocities were during the conflict, and what do you think motivates them?
I mean, I think that they were very widespread. Primarily conducted, let's be honest, from the Azerbaijani side. Azerbaijan was the one that were advancing and capturing territories and having access to like civilian populations and stuff. Of most people, of the few people would stay behind, and the Armenian ones were more limited. The Armenia committed war crimes in this conflict as well too, in the form of shelling cities with ballistic missiles. But that, not to say anything cancels out, but Azerbaijan as well did the same thing. They discriminately bombarded population centers throughout the entirety of the war. And then, there are a number of graphic videos that came out of Azerbaijani soldiers mutilating, executing defenseless civilians or defenseless captured combatants. And, reports just continue to come out, and to the point where now, even over 6 months after the end of the war, we know Azerbaijan still holds nearly 200 Armenian captives and has tortured and executed in custody at least 19 of them.
And so in 2004, an Azerbaijani officer, Ramil Safarov, was convicted of murdering an Armenian officer, Gurgen Magarian, with an axe during a NATO-sponsored training event in Hungary, and he was sentenced to life in prison. But in 2012, he was extradited to Azerbaijan, where he was given a hero's welcome, immediately pardoned, promoted, and issued back pay. To what extent do you think this mentality is still present in the leadership of Azerbaijan, especially given their behavior during the 44-day-long war last autumn?
I mean, it's the bedrock of the regime, this anti-Armenian sentiment. This has been the tool. This is something that came around under Ilham Aliyev, especially, who is the son of the former president, Haydar Aliyev. Ilham, who came into power in 2003, and from the late 2000s, especially, they started spreading this extreme anti-Armenian rhetoric, portray Armenians as subhuman and the enemy, and to be destroyed at all costs. And then, the Safarov case is one of the most poignant of those, where this guy who murdered the defenseless Armenian officer in his sleep, and at his trial was extremely unrepentant and very proud, and said, I would have killed as many Armenians as I possibly could have got my hands on, and then returned to Azerbaijan, and was pardoned and given the hero's welcome. And so we saw, and that's the exact sort of act that we saw repeated a number of times during the war. There's videos out there of Azerbaijani soldiers in the same fashion, where we're used to seeing from ISIS videos in Iraq and Syria, but the difference being that this is a member of a state military, a state's armed forces, holding down captive Armenians, elderly civilians, and cutting their throats. And then we see it again in the Baku about less than 2 months ago. Opened the military trophies park in Baku, which features helmets from Armenian soldiers killed on the battlefield, which features wax caricatures of Armenian soldiers that were the creators proudly state that they made them look as grotesque as possible. And this is the entire underpinning of the Aliyev regime, is to focus attention on this external enemy and to deflect attention from the regime's own abuses as one of the lowest human rights ranking countries on earth, to direct it towards the hated, dehumanized enemy that is the Armenians.
So you think that the authoritarian nature of Azerbaijan's government plays a specific role in exacerbating the conflict and sort of spurring ethnic hatred?
Yeah, I mean, there's little doubt about that. I mean, like, let's not pretend in Armenia that there is particularly positive attitude towards Azerbaijanis either, but it is nowhere near comparable, I don't think, to the level of just dehumanizing hatred. I mean, there was no put it here. The slogans that were coming out during the war from Aliyev again and again, and that were featured on the drones and everything, like Iti Kovan, dog chaser, and Aliyev himself said again and again in speeches, "We are chasing them out like dogs. We will crush them like rats. Armenia is a country of slaves." And this sort of rhetoric was not present here, and I don't think has ever been present. It's just to a far more visceral degree, and it's really the sort of thing that if the outsiders, I think it's just shocking. I mean, I remember the reaction to this war museum when it opened up. It was a lot of social media was just aghast at it, including a lot of Turkish social media, which has generally a lot more sympathy for the Azerbaijani side, but a lot of Turkish social media users were just appalled by this. And then, with small exceptions, Azerbaijani social media was, justifying it, defending it, and saying, "Why is it? All sorts of countries have museums in the world, and they occupied our lands, and why is this wrong?" So it's the sort of thing that's it's been inculcated from primary school age for at least the past, say, 12 years under Ilham Aliyev, and it really is just this sort of thing that even if Aliyev leaves tomorrow, it will take so long to bring these societies towards any sort of coexistence, given that this is the notion that's been embedded in Azerbaijan.
So on that note, what do you think the state of opposition politics is in Azerbaijan? I mean, Aliyev has just won a successful war. He seems to have at least some support for his, for the regime and for the kind of rhetoric that he uses. Is there any prospect for a rise in opposition to Ilham Aliyev?
I mean, I don't really think so. I'm not an Azerbaijani politics expert, but as I've read from friends who know much more than me, especially Azeri friends, is that the opposition, this war was broadly popular in Azerbaijan, and a lot of that is not even just due to the regime's rhetoric, but the Azerbaijanis have legitimate grievances from the first war. In the process of after Karabakh Oblast itself was secured by Armenia largely in 1992, 1993 was largely the war of conquest, and our ethnic Armenian forces drove 500,000 Azeris out of their homes in the surrounding regions, and so there was enough of this, and so that was around probably 10% of the population of Azerbaijan at that time. So you can imagine that's enough for people in Azerbaijan more broadly to all know someone who was affected by this, or to have enough personal experience with this for it to be real for them. And so that this war was broadly very popular in Azerbaijan, and this notion of grievance and taking revenge on Armenia, and we've seen that with politics in Azerbaijan is that it's very underdeveloped to say the least, because it's an extremely unfree system that famously in the 2013 elections they announced the results of the election the day before the vote. But still, the opposition politicians such as they are tried to the regime nationalism in some. There's no, against the war, as far as I can tell, has not been something that's featured in any sort of prominent sense. So it's I don't think I'm not an expert on Azerbaijan internal dynamics, but I'm reading what I have.
Neil, you still there?
Yeah.
Okay, you cut it out for a little second, but I want to ask you then. Talking more about sort of the conflict. What do you think the largest barrier to a long-term peace is? What's in the way of the two sides coming together and working out an agreement on how to manage the conflict?
I think largely in that each side has a completely opposite idea of what peace is. And at least let's state the official positions, and Armenia, I can say this is the majority view here as well. In Azerbaijan, I'm not as sure, but and for Armenia and for the Armenian population of Karabakh especially, it's the outcome and it's about the only one that's acceptable to them is eventually independence for Karabakh and separation from Azerbaijan. And in Azerbaijan, it's integration of Karabakh. as part of Azerbaijan and maintaining the territorial integrity. So obviously the two sides are those are mutually exclusive positions. And then beyond that, for many years, the dynamics of this conflict have flipped in a way that's also very toxic as well. For many years, not at the start, but over the last 10 years, let's say, I think in Armenia, there's been more of a sense of, we are in the early years post-conflict, there was a chance for a real resolution, let's say the first 5-7 years afterwards. But after that, after failed negotiations, positions started to harden to the point where, let's say by about 10 years ago, I think there was already at the point here where most people in Armenia and Karabakh would not have considered giving land for peace, which was always giving some of the occupied territories in exchange for a deal, which was always on the table. And now that situation has flipped, and now Azerbaijan are the ones that are the victorious side, and are not inclined to settle whatsoever in any sense, and as was revealed in the new crisis group report that came out yesterday, detailing some of the behind the scenes negotiations between Russia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, is that Azerbaijan is pushing for this absolute maximalist outcome, which will just lead towards that they don't want to take any step that doesn't lead towards Karabakh being coming under their control. And so unless we see some softening of that from Baku now, being the victorious side and holding more of the cards, then there's going to be, until that happens, there's just going to be this absolute deadlock until something else, unless there's some other catastrophic change in the internal situation of either country or in the conflict itself.
Well, so as a result of the war and the sort of ensuing political crisis, the president of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, called snap elections for the 20th of June, which are in 10 days now. Can you briefly explain who the leading candidates are, what you think the outcome of the elections will be, and how it'll kind of affect the Armenian politics?
Oh Lord, this could be about a 20-minute answer here, but I'll try and keep it short. So, in short, I mean, so there was the bloodless revolution here in early 2018, and Nikol Pashinyan came to power, and then won an election in late 2018, affirming his mandate, in which he had about 75% popular approval, extremely high numbers. Then the war happened, and then went on for about 2 years. The war happened. He suffered from that quite heavily, but still was in a commanding position over his rivals. And then steadily, since the end of the war, the government has, and especially him himself, have been so erratic and dysfunctional that they have eroded their support. And that has really come to a head in the last 6 weeks here, the last month, let's say, since the start of this border crisis, with Azerbaijani troops occupying two small corners of Armenia proper, not Karabakh. And that has made Pashinyan look extremely weak, and his erratic behavior seemingly inventing new scandals with thin air every day continues to harm him. And in the midst of all this, the leading candidate from the opposition, the second president, Robert Kacharyan, has gone up and up in the ratings, which is remarkable because Robert Kacharyan, I would say, prior to this, and probably still, underneath the pressing issue of electing someone, he's one of the most hated figures in Armenia. Everyone remembers his rule as, a time of great corruption and lawlessness, and officials enriching themselves, and emigration, people leaving the country because of his rule. And now it looks like it's starting to look as if he is positioned to be the genuine popular choice coming to this election. If current trends continue as they are, which it's hard to see them changing because every day there's some new insane thing coming out of Nikol's mouth at some campaign rally, and so it's too early to call. There's too many undecided people, but it is not trending in a good direction for Pashinyan.
Mm-hmm. What do you think the long-term sort of cultural and political ramifications of the war and of the loss of the territories surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh will be for Armenia and for Armenians?
I mean, the number one thing is, sort of this absolute shattering of this myth of invincibility that was going on. As one of my favorite analyst, Richard Girgosian, calls it, the bullshit exceptionalism, which was just this attitude that set in over time, that we beat the Turks once, we beat the Azeris once, and we'll always beat them because they're weak, we're strong, we're heroic and clever and powerful, and they're stupid and weak. And that we'll be able to hold on to everything. And yeah, well, there's no way that we'll really lose this war. And that, at least, it was something that was very much the popular conception and was shattered. And now it's just gone completely in the opposite direction, where people are concerned about losing everything that's left from, there were, especially with these incursions in the last month, but people are concerned about, the future of the Republic of Armenia itself. And understandably, when you look at it in the context of if you consider Armenia and Karabakh, Artsakh, to be, essentially 110 years ago, before the genocide, and then just after that, Armenians were essentially ethnically cleansed from 85% of the territory in which they historically lived, and they don't exist there anymore in Western Armenia, nowadays Eastern Turkey. And so with this small amount, 15% left, and now more of it just having been captured and cleansed, you can understand why people are extremely stressed out about what's happening right now. And this has become, it's been extremely difficult for people to deal with.
So I have a couple more questions for you, but I also want to encourage listeners in our audience that if they would like to ask a question, we'll have some time later. And so please indicate, I think there's a button you can press where you can indicate that you would like to speak. We'll let some time at the end for questions. But for now, I want to also ask you, you mentioned the Armenian genocide, and, several months ago, the Biden administration finally made good on its promise and recognized the Armenian genocide. And obviously this caused a big storm in Turkey. But what was the reaction like in Armenia, and how do you think that has that recognition given some kind of hope to the Armenians that maybe the international community will take their issue more seriously, or do you think it's just a symbolic gesture?
I mean, people were definitely happy with it. Like, let's not say that they weren't. People were definitely very pleased with it, and they felt like finally this has happened. Although on the other side, I do know quite a few people who said, this is like, to do this now after all this time, after there's just this tiny sort of, tangibly meaningless measure after what happened last year, and the U.S. not saying or doing anything during it, really cheapened it for them. So, I mean, of course, people were happy that it happened, and people have been fighting for this for a long time. But at the same time, the concerns here are so pressing, and especially starting May 12th with the border crisis here, with the Azerbaijani soldiers occupying the two areas of the Republic of Armenia and just raising the specter that they might try and take more. That has by far overtaken the discourse here. I mean, there's way more. Essentially, that was nice at the moment, but between that and the election, and the two things are very tied together. People have far more pressing concerns, and that's basically gone out the window. People that hasn't been mentioned since shortly after it happened here, let's say.
And so far, the international community has been relatively silent about the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, especially compared to other conflicts in the region, including the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, it's very much the case. And, I sort of, there's a few factors that go into this. I mean, one is that it doesn't have this, it's a complicated conflict, and you can't just paint it in some nice, simple way, such as, oh, here's Russia, and they're clearly the bad guy in Russia. Everyone loves the sexy story about evil Russia. And so we saw, I knew it was different, and then I saw an analysis on the number of New York Times headlines that mentioned the 2008 war when that was happening versus this one, and it was literally 20 times as much, and it was the coverage in American papers especially was to the point where, Washington Post not only didn't send anyone here, but they didn't commission anything the entire time from the ground for 44 days. And the second factor, obviously, is the timing of it. it was during the Trump time, during Trump presidency, where that anything Trump says or does ever has to occupy 80% of American airwaves. And then it was the election was happening, and then it was also COVID time, and then the first week of the war, Trump got COVID, and so just forget it. That has to be 100% of the coverage all the time. Trump has COVID. And then the thirdly is just a more systemic factor is that the media industry is dying. No one outside of publicly funded entities like the BBC or Radio Free Europe, although even those are touchy. And no one outside of those or, New York Times and Washington Post has a sustainable funding model. And so the number of people working in journalism these days and the amount of resources that outlets have is like 15% of what it was in 2008. So, yeah, the industry is just in a seemingly endless death spiral. And that's leading to a lot of the available remaining airtime being given to, low cost, quote unquote, reporting on Twitter drama and, internal New York Times Slack chat drama and stuff like this that doesn't cost anything to produce. And so here's all those factors that lead together to, this being a blip on the radar, a blip on the nighttime news in Europe, and just, not even mentioned broadly in the US.
So I know you've also been critical of the way that some of the human rights organizations like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch have covered the region. Why do you think it is that there's a kind of blind spot among many international organizations, not just human rights organizations, but as you say, the press, in kind of knowledge about this conflict and in covering this conflict?
I mean, the press, I think, when they were here, the ones that came here, I think broadly did a pretty good job. Especially given, that this is a very complex conflict and almost none of these people have any idea or have been here before or know what's going on. I think the coverage did evolve after the first week or two to a place that was okay. The human rights organizations, I think, were just really bad at their jobs. Like, I was just following the same Telegram channels as anyone else, let's say maybe 8 or 10 that were on there that were posting stuff from this war, especially there was like 1 or 2 that were posting the really gruesome stuff. And every time I would mention something, I would get people from Human Rights Watch and from Amnesty and whatnot that would message me asking me to send them the video. And that happened probably 6 or 8 times. So, and I would just think I would just think to myself, like, there's like 2 channels that these are appearing on. Like, do your job. Don't ask me to do it for you. But that's what happened, and then you end up coming out with these incomplete reports that they later have to try and explain away in Twitter threads that no one sees because they're not on the report itself, and the report has already come out. And yeah, just generally them being bad at their jobs, I think, is what it was.
Yes, I think we have a question from the audience as well. Thank you very much, Neil.
Neil, I was wondering, obviously, whatever your view on Karabakh is, there is a pretty sort of clear line between that and the apparent border kind of incursions that have been by Azerbaijani troops over the past few weeks. Karabakh is internationally recognised as part of Azerbaijan, like it just is, but obviously Armenian territory proper is not. So, how serious are these fears? Is it actually plausible that Azerbaijan could sort of invade and occupy Armenia proper?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, of course, this is something that a lot of people are concerned about, and that there's a lot of theories floating around out there, and a lot of people worrying about this. My view is that this is really, this is just that it's much more simple and mundane than that this is just, if Azerbaijan moving some forces in, whether from command from the top or just, local leeway for the local commanders, them moving their forces across the ill-defined borderline by a kilometer or 2 is just a very easy way to cause chaos and cause panic and, just sort of humiliate Nikol Pashinyan, which, as we've seen for Ilham Aliyev, is something that he very much enjoys doing. And then it's sort of like a successful outcome in itself. I think that the real risk is if there were to be armed clashes that could turn into something else that could escalate out of control, and then that would be on these border areas, and then give some pretext for some broader conflict. That would be far more dangerous for Armenia. So they've had to tread really carefully in terms of, trying to avoid that, while also guarding against, different incursions, or guarding against Azeri troops moving the lines forward further. And so we've just seen all these videos of fist fights and things like that happening, which aren't good, but are far from that. But at any rate, I don't buy into these theories that go flow around that, yes, Ilham Aliyev does say things like Zangezur, Sunik is ancient Azeri land, Yerevan is ancient Azeri land, but I don't think that this is all part of some ploy by which they're just going to go in and conquer half of Armenia.
Thanks, Neil. I think we have another question from the front.
I was wondering, Neil, whether you thought that, given that the war occurred on the Iranian border, and indeed it was visible partially from Iran, why Iran does not engage in the region, why Iran was not participating.
Yeah, it's a funny thing, and that, you would assume that Iran, being one of the three major powers, historical empires that borders this region, would have a big impact on this conflict. And in fact, seemingly the exact opposite is true, is that Iran has essentially no impact whatsoever. And I think there's a lot of factors for this. Iran has potential domestic concerns, hosting both a large ethnic Azeri population that it's always wary of, any sort of seemingly pro-separatist sentiment, and then a much smaller ethnic Armenian community, but one that Iran likes to hold up as this sort of model minority that they grant privileges to and show off, that Iran's a harmonious multi-ethnic state. And then just more broadly, Iran, its resources are invested in the Middle East, and it knows how to deal. It's good at dealing with the sort of states that exist in the Middle East. These sorts of highly dysfunctional states like Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, where it can exert power via these local little proxy militias, and that exist outside the state's control, and can operate like that. Whereas this is a very different scenario. This isn't ill-equipped militias fighting each other. This is full-scale state armies clashing, and these are functional states, unlike Iraq or Syria. So it's a completely different environment, and it's one where they're unsuited to, and it's very hard to see how they would have an impact even if they wanted to. And we've seen that in their ceasefire attempts, their ceasefire proposals were all just ignored. Their proposals to resolve the conflict were ignored, and they essentially just sat back and watched the whole conflict unfold.
Thank you. Another question from Melon.
Hey, Neil. Love your work. Just had a question for you about the future. So obviously the conflict is sort of frozen at the moment, but what do you think is going to happen in Armenia with the elections coming up, and in Azerbaijan as well?
I mean, in Armenia, it'll be a mess to some degree either way, because whichever guy, I'm sure the vote itself will not be totally fair. I mean, Pashinyan who controls the administrative resources, is really losing it in the last couple of weeks, and I do think there will be some significant irregularities. But at any rate, with the result of the election, if either Pashinyan wins or the guy isn't going to accept it, and they will out in the streets, everyone there's not really at the moment for what to do or what to do in the form of, well, with the Nikol wins again, considering that the entire upper staff of the foreign ministry, the foreign minister and then all four deputy foreign ministers have all quit in the last week. And so who's going to be the diplomats in his administration? And then, as well, Armenia doesn't have, there's not much they can do except negotiate and try and renegotiate the terms. The will supplement.
Hello, Neil. You're back.
Yeah, sorry. I guess the connection
It seemed like
dropped
you had some connection issues. Do you want to finish the rest of your answer to Melon?
Yeah. I mean, I was just wrapping up saying that, I think that whatever happens here with the outcome of the election, the foreign policy won't vastly change in the short term. We might see, all parties are committed to the relationship with Russia. So, that's Qatar might be a little less, probably be a little less open to France or the U.S. But broadly with regards to Karabakh, there's not going to be that much change.
Thanks. Thank you, Melon, for your question. Christian, do you have another question?
Yes, I do. First off, Neil, thank you very much for your work. I've been following you for a long time. But as a random nobody, I've noticed a trend among Turkish and Azeri nationalists, especially not just with denial, but also with a lot of whataboutism, because there are certainly legitimate grievances when it comes to the expulsions from Karabakh and Armenia proper, and even going back to World War I, the massacre of Turkish civilians by Russian imperial troops. But none of that takes away from what Armenians have suffered, and I wanted to ask if you had any tips for threading the needle between acknowledging Armenian and Azerbaijani grievances without overwriting the other.
Yeah, I mean, I don't I think it's very, very simple to do both. I mean, and just you could acknowledge both of them, and it comes back to that sort of, why do people deny things like this? Because it's more convenient to just to say that our side was our side was to believe that your side is the morally right one, or the morally pure one, the morally clean one. And there's a lot of different factors that go into this, but you don't have to deny the genocide in order to push in order to make people aware that yes, hundreds of thousands of Azerbaijani civilians were expelled from the areas surrounding Karabakh, or you don't have to deny that happened as an Armenian in order to justify, or in order to point out the pogroms in Sumgait and Ganja and Baku. These things aren't mutually exclusive; they exist in the same universe, and that's what makes this conflict so complex, is that everyone has been victims at different times to different degrees. Sure, absolutely. I mean, there's only one genocide in the course of this conflict. Well, in the course of, let's say, the 100 years of things that are more broadly related to this conflict, not the specific context of the Azeri-Armenian conflict. But that doesn't mean that that massacres. Oh, if only 5,000 people were killed, or let's say if only 20,000 people were killed in the March days in 1918 in Baku. That doesn't mean that's too small of a number to matter, or that it doesn't matter. So it's just a matter of being cognizant and aware of your wording in these things, but then also admitting what did happen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christian. I think we have one more question from Chris this time.
Hi, yes. First and foremost, Neil, I've been following your work since the start of the war. Very well done journalism. I think you're a very objective voice, and I appreciate that. My question involves the election and the political discourse, to put it kindly, that's going on in Armenia right now. I'm hearing things about Pashinyan giving up his seat for 20 to 25 POWs, and the election coming in either way. Now, in terms of the result, whether it be Kocharyan or Pashinyan or whoever else, what do you think in any of the outcomes? How do you think the Azerbaijani government will respond, or what would be the ideal outcome of the Armenian election for the Azerbaijani government?
I guess for them, it's probably just chaos. Yeah, the more chaotic for them, the better. There is this thing that's going on. There is something, sort of a meme that supporters of Kacharyan like to say is that, oh, Aliyev respects him. Aliyev's scared of him because he's this big, strong guy, this classic like post-Soviet strongman, and that if he comes back to power, then they'll have a strong negotiating position because Rob is just so big and tough and scary, which just sounds ridiculous as you spell it out, and especially no matter who wins the election, then Armenia is still in the same position, having just lost a war recently and suffered devastating military losses in the course of that. And for Azerbaijan, I mean, maybe Aliyev would somewhat prefer Nikol as like the guy because the guy who was in power when he defeated him, and he can taunt Nikol endlessly for that, as he very much enjoys doing. And for a guy like Heydar Aliyev, that might be enough. But overall, I doubt it matters too much. Just that Baku will be happy to see any sort of chaos and any sort of drawn out disorderly process in Yerevan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris and Neil. We're going to have one final question from Kenneth.
Hi. So my question was with regards to the historical presence of a large Kurdish population in Karabakh. I just wanted to know if there's any discourse with regard to that fact, if there's any input from the Kurdish community.
Yeah, that is an interesting thing. I mean, at this point, really seems to be much more of a historical footnote kind of thing. There was, especially in Kelbajar and Lachen regions, in the prior to the first war, there was quite a large Kurdish population. There was a short-lived initiative in '92 when the Armenians captured some of these areas to set up a Kurdish republic there that fell apart, almost as quickly as it was launched. But in broader discourse, I mean, these Kurdish people will all be IDPs in Azerbaijan, in which they play no role in any public discourse that I can see. I mean, maybe they factor to some degree an internal matter in Azerbaijan, which I'm not an expert on, but they're not mentioned by Aliyev or by the Azeri government in its statements about, oh, we need to make sure that we protect Kurdish heritage or that the Kurdish population of the region returns, because Azerbaijan makes a big point out of everyone being just Azerbaijanis, and we are the multi-ethnic, as their slogan, land of tolerance. And so they make a point of not differentiating between different ethnic groups, and so that cuts any possibility of any Kurd particular discourse out of the conversation.
Thank you very much, Kenneth, for your question. We're gonna end now. So thank you very much, Neil, for joining us. You've been a fantastic guest, and I hope that everyone who's listening, thanks for joining, and I hope you've enjoyed this event. If you'd like to learn more about the Human Rights Foundation and the work we do, please visit our website, hrf.org, and follow us on Twitter right here. We will be hosting more events like this, where we dive into some other authoritarian regimes and conflicts around the world. And so be sure to follow us. And of course, please follow our guest today, Neil Hauer. He has the best commentary and analysis in the South Caucasus, I think. I'm sure you'll do well out of that. So once again, thank you very much, Neil, for joining us. Thank you for all of our listeners. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for joining us.